Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dr. Justin Smith, and I serve as our Director of Student Life for Forbes College and a member of the Office of the Dean of Undergraduate Students here at Princeton. FOCUS is an interdisciplinary initiative sponsored and designed by my office to bring anti-racist scholarship, thought, and action to every part of the university life. The name and mission of FOCUS were inspired by the words of Toni Morrison, a recipient of the 1993 Nobel Prize in Literature, and one of Princeton's most illustrious faculty members. As Princeton recommits itself to racial equity, the goal of FOCUS is to keep anti-racism at the forefront of campus dialogue. FOCUS is intended to bring unparalleled expertise, insight, and considered thought to the difficult but necessary conversations that lie ahead. We aspire to a world in which everyone can focus on what really matters, free from the distraction of racism. We are grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with the Department of African American Studies and the Humanities Council in tonight's program. Imani Perry, the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and a faculty associate in the program, faculty associate with the programs in Law and Public Affairs, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Jazz Studies. She's the author of 6 acclaimed books, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, May We Forever Stand, a history of the Black National Anthem, and Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. Her most recent work, a travelogue entitled South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, becomes available at the end of this month. Professor Perry is also a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the author of its newsletter, Unsettled Territory. Perry is a scholar of law, literary, and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Harvard University, a JD from Harvard Law School, an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center, and a BA from Yale College in Literature and American Studies. Her writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. Like Ms. Broome, Imani Perry has roots in the South and is a native of Birmingham, Alabama. Sarah Broome is a trained journalist and celebrated author. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, and elsewhere. In 2016, Broome received the prestigious Whiting Award for Creative Nonfiction, which allowed her to finish her first book, The Yellow House. Her groundbreaking work received the National Book Award in 2019. Broome received her undergraduate degree in anthropology and mass communications from the University of North Texas before earning a master's degree in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley. She began her writing career as a newspaper journalist working in Rhode Island, Dallas, New Orleans, and Hong Kong for Time Asia. Broome worked as an editor at the Oprah Magazine, for several years, writing in the hours before and after work. In the years following, Broome worked extensively in the nonprofit world, including as executive director of the global nonprofit Village Health Works, which has offices in Burundi and New York. She has taught nonfiction in Columbia University's creative writing department. And Sarah Broome loves solitude, travel, making a beautiful room, and the possibility of getting lost. A native New Orleanian, she is the youngest of 12 children. Sarah Broome currently calls New York her home, and we are honored and thrilled to have her in conversation with Imani Perry today. Following our conversation, we will have an opportunity to take questions from our audience, including those currently watching via live stream. All are invited to submit questions via comments, and we look forward to an illuminating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. So, welcome to Princeton.
Imani.
How you doing?
Good. I'm so happy to talk with you always.
I feel the same way, and notwithstanding the unusual circumstances, it's such a gift to be able to be in conversation with you. We have these conversations usually privately, so it's wonderful to get to share some of them.
We're going to have some version of one publicly.
Yeah. So I wanted to start actually sort of where that lovely introduction ended with making a room. And I specifically wanted to ask you, and I'll say it this way. As a reader of your work, I think your attention to space, architecture, geographies is just, it's so gorgeous and powerful. And I don't know if if a reader necessarily knows how the minutia of your attention to all of those things. As I want to ask you about seating and settees, because we've had these, we've talked about our grandmother's furniture in the past. And can you talk about maybe just a little bit about why furnishings for you are this important, I don't know, these important artifacts?
Oh my God. See, this is really approximating how we talk to each other, right? This is so interesting because I think there's this wonderful little pamphlet called A Desk in Exile.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that I still have trouble with is thinking more philosophically about furniture, about objects, about space, about myself in space, about the things that compose me in space, about myself in relation to you, for instance, in space.
Yeah.
And maybe furniture is one sort of approximation of how we think about space. And then, of course, there is this sort of, I feel this very spiritually. It's what I think the artist Whitfield Lavelle is trying to get at when he paints on the walls. Because I also am very connected to the chair, the object, as having this history. Even actually approaching this particular chair, I was like, oh, the seat is so worn. I wonder who was here before me, right? That there are these containers that we can sort of find to start to think about history and time and travel through time, and that maybe there are traces in that, right? That we somehow can think about geography, history, loss, my love for you, my respect for you, through this particular chair or these two chairs.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I don't remember, and I think you had posted it on Instagram, there was a chair, and I was thinking that looks like a seat in my grandmother's house, and one of the things that's so remarkable to me about having those pieces is the kind of care that they put into maintaining them. So, like, how does, you know, that chair my grandmother bought in the 40s look better than the one I bought 4 years ago? Right. Sorry. And so to care, it's a connection, and it's also, it's a tradition of some sort, right? To hold on to.
It is. I mean, the object, right? And I mean, it's interesting because in the Yellow House, for instance, I was thinking about this the other day because I saw my niece, who I hadn't seen in forever. And because I have so many siblings, some of them were having children at the same time as my mom. And this niece of mine, you know, going back to me being an aunt before I could talk, this niece of mine was born a month before me, you know. And so we would sleep in the same slipper chair. My mom had these sort of gold fabric slipper chairs. And me and this niece, who is called Toka, we would lay side by side in this slipper chair. And that was sort of the way that we grew up, essentially together, right? Sleeping in this chair. And I remember that chair, and I wonder about that chair. And I think this is also something that, in the sense that we write towards something that we want to see more of, I think reading the philosopher Gaston Bachelard in Poetics of Space and thinking, well, why does he get to write about the bureau or the armoire and make all of these sort of connections between a door and how we sort of imagine ourselves in the world? You know, how is he doing that?
Yeah.
And why, how can I do some approximation of that? And why isn't it done more?
Oh, I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
So the sort of object that carries us, that has all of these sort of significances for us, the object as signifier and maybe even signified, and possession,
Yeah. Yes.
and the sort of complication of possessing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, part of what you described resonated so deeply because my cousin Nichelle and I used to sleep foot to head on my grandmother's black couch, right? And that was, and so there's the material culture piece, which we don't, I think particularly for Black folks, Black Americans, and Black Americans in the South, there's not a conversation, even though material culture is so important, like fabrics and textures, and there's not, what you're describing is so true. There's not a way of even conceiving of that, right, in the arena, which is why it's so important to write it. And it's also about intimacy, right? So when there are times when I say, okay, well, sometimes we were four to a bed, but I'm also thinking about the headboard with the cutouts in it, and putting my finger in the head, right, and feeling the presence of the other kids on either side, and that putting those together, that relation, intimacy, love. So it's not just an artifact, but it's
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's not all performative. It's not, I think in the context of Black women especially, right? We get these sort of presentations of making a home as a kind of performative, almost class issue.
Right.
Right? It's a thing for show.
Right.
But as human beings, there is a kind of internal show that's going on that is about, if I have a great love for 12 years and I don't have it anymore, is that an object inside of me? Right? Like how do I process what's sort of within and without?
Oh, yeah.
And, as Black women have been doing this, Black American women have had to do this forever. And I think it's often framed, right, as a sort of performative gesture. I mean, if you think of Toni Cade Bambara's "Those Bones Are Not My Child," that opening prologue, the waiting, the anxiety, everything this woman feels, the description of her house, what it's like to be in it.
Yes.
That's all part of a kind of internal grounding, an internal sense of self, and the bed you were on, right, is part of that picture.
Right. And that for me is the mastery. And I know now you have spent years of me being like, let me tell you what's so masterful about the Yellow House. but is that it becomes the house. The book is the house too. Right, and what you just described with Toni Cade Bambara, and it's relation, but it's the building, the architecture. It's not so that it's. To go back what you were saying about what is possession, right? The thing may be gone, right? The bed itself, that couch is long gone in my own experience, but there's something that you can make in the absence and the loss. Right, which doesn't mean that the creation of spaces or taking possession of things is irrelevant, but it's also, it's transitory. It's impermanent.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it really, right? It's sort of like in the drive to claim oneself. Right, there are things, houses, people along the way, and I think that kind of sight. That what actually Toni Morrison was talking about, right? That we're not always actually looking at you, that in fact we may not be looking at you at all. Right. That actually we're just concerned about our own claim on ourselves, and that's worthy and that's enough.
Yes.
And I think part of the book for me was just a kind of involuntary reflex. Because it felt so ridiculous that I grew up around some of the most fascinating people on planet Earth, and they were in a box that wasn't even on the map. I just thought, that is so bizarre. How could it be? Right? I mean, it just seemed like the biggest mistake I had ever come upon.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, so that's part of, I think, maybe what writers do in some way.
Remap.
Right,
Right,
and
yeah,
reclaim,
yeah.
and reclaim ourselves, and reclaim the things we know are valuable, and reclaim the space to not be worried about, you know, anyone else.
But who's here?
Yeah, somehow.
So at this point, and I'm asking this question, I mean, it's a kind of history question. And I think I want to ask it because we're in this strange interstitial space historically, where we're constantly like worried. But I'm also, you know, as a writer, right, you have to be deliberate in everything that you attend to. What feels, I don't know, I guess what feels urgent to you now? What feels like the kind of questions that you feel you need to meditate on? Both, you know what I mean? Like that you're like dwelling with, that you're turning over.
Oh, that's such a good question, right? I think my questions are always very philosophical. And, you know, I think the best questions just make you seek more. You know, they never ever prompt resolution. Ever. And, you know, it's so weird to be, because I've been spending so much time in New Orleans recently, and New Orleans just feels like it's at the forefront of this conversation about climate. And yet New Orleans doesn't have the infrastructure for telling these very pressing stories. I mean, it has a newspaper that's been shrunk. It doesn't actually have the avenues that one might imagine such a city should have.
Right.
And it has people who are in despair.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Ida was no joke. Everyone is still rebuilding, and we have this going on in small ways throughout the country. So I think right now I'm very preoccupied with what we're not hearing in this sort of big sound system that seems to be happening, where people are very obsessed with detail, but detail about what? Right? And I'm sort of listening for sub-frequencies, if that makes sense, and just trying to understand sort of where, you know, I always thought of myself as a writer. You know, I'm definitely more Billie Holiday in the sense of, you know, I'm way behind the beat. You know, the song has gone, and then I'll like come in, you know, and I'm not like ahead of the song or even with the song.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think trying to sort of, and the Yellow House was really about that, because time had gone by and no one was really thinking in the same way about what happened in 2005. And so the questions for me are very much the questions about creation. What does it mean to make in this world? What are the important things to say? How do you say it? How are you new? How do you make discoveries? Is it still possible to get lost? Right? What are the spaces we make intended for? Right?
Yeah.
I think they're about quality of life somehow. What about you? What are the questions that are?
Well, I think related to what you're saying is I find there's this incredible urgency to this moment, right? And I was thinking, but also because, you know, right, so you've been in journalism and in health, right? And in health and right, these areas, right, that have that are at the cutting edge, right? In the same way that New Orleans is at the cutting edge, right? And so, and I think, there's moments where I'm like, okay, well, I've studied law, and like, we're talking about voting rights, and we're talking, right? But I don't want to be in the frenetic pace of the moment, because these are really, really difficult challenges. And at some level, I think they're bringing us to core questions, right? And so how does one be, the question for me is like, how do you be in the world, how am I in the world ethically, not, trying to put out fire, and some fires do need to be, some things need an urgent response, but with care, right?
Yes.
With this vision of trying to do something or make things that we can carry with us over the, over the next mountain, which is coming, right? Things are changing, right? These assumptions, these expectations about what our lives will be like in 10 years and 20 years, I don't think we can hold them as carefully. And so I think that's also about making space. Who's in your space? How do you care for who's with you? What are the terms of that care? What happens when those things are snatched from underneath you, right? And right, and there are storms that are examples of that, but there's also these sort of other metaphoric storms of, the pandemic and loss of all sorts of things. And so I guess trying to figure out how to be of use and also to fulfill what feels like the thing that is both soul nurturing and meaningful.
Right.
Right? Like
That's
that.
it. I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about at the start, right? It's sort of the traces, what gets left behind, the old chair that we recover.
Yes.
It's sort of, I mean, I think particularly, and I wonder how you feel with your own work, but it's sort of like, what does the body of work even look like anymore, right? What's the job really?
Right.
As writers and as thinking people. It feels like, this reminds me of when James Baldwin said, I hope someone will find me in the rubbish, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like, what are we trying to do in terms of the work we make, and to think about impact feels strange.
Right,
Me.
at least in the conventional way, right? I mean, I remember I had this moment when I was very ill as a young woman, when I said, I don't know if I'll be able to do all these things I want to do. And I was like, I'm going to focus on making blankets, right? And because I love to crochet, and I was like, I'm going to crochet blankets because it's something that I know somebody will be able to hold in the future, right? Like I was like, I don't know if I'll be able to write these books, or I don't know if I'll be able to go do these degrees or doing it, but I do, there's that same feeling now, like, and it's not a personal illness, but like the sort of the state of the world, where it's like, something precious to hold on to as opposed to a legacy written in the sky in some way,
Yeah, that's right.
Right, but I think that's also the tradition, like I think that sensibility, I mean, certainly for the writers you referenced, that's part of our tradition, like the standing in a tradition of people who approach the work that way, even if later they become,
Right.
Yeah.
And that is the paying attention, right? The blanket is the paying attention. The crocheting is the paying attention. And so maybe that's the job, that there's, that paying attention is actual work. And I know it is, because there are so many times in the course of a day when I don't want to pay attention because it's just too much, right? So figuring out how that becomes the essence of the work itself.
Yeah.
Going forward, right? Just the act of, there's this New Orleans artist, Kevin Beasley.
Oh, yes.
And there was a New York Times piece about him, and in it says, just showing up was the art. For him, just showing up was the art. And I think for me in this particular moment, that has such great resonance.
Can I ask you a question about art?
Yeah.
Because one of the things, and I think, again, it's one of those it's apparent you're a person who crafts sentences and geographies and narrative, but there's a visual component, and it's very clear that visual art is important to your work. And I'm wondering if there's work, whether Kevin Beasley or other artists, that at this moment you're finding as a source as you're working on, what you're making.
You know, there is, and it keeps changing, which I think is so exciting. There's this New Orleans artist called Don Dideau, who has a big exhibition now at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And it's been great to sort of go there. I was thinking about the writer Hashim Matar, a month in Siena, and he would go over time and look at the same painting over and over, sometimes for a year. And so it's been so nice in New Orleans to show up and look at this work of Don Dideau, who does has this kind of cosmologic, astral space preoccupation. And it's these huge, overwhelming images, right? Some of which are about the world and destruction and the end of the world. But I think right now I'm just in love with artists of all kinds, and I live with an artist, and I think sound and thinking about rhythm, and I mean, art is shoring me up in ways I never anticipated, So it'll be interesting to see in the next work I'm making how it gives me courage to do or not do certain things, because I think that's always the thing, right? We're making little boats for each new story. Also known as structure. And so I think art is the thing that helps you take risk when you're doing that. So I think Don Dideau is somebody who is giving me a lot of courage.
I just love that example because I think particularly for nonfiction, I think there is a way that people often consider it as somehow something other than art. When in many ways it's a lot like painting, right? I mean, it's it's capturing something that's between imagination and the materiality of the world as it.
It really is. I mean, you know that. I mean, there is so much in character and movement and pace and tone. Didion used to always say, nonfiction is so much harder because I already know the story. So you spend all this time about how you tell it. Right. I think you actually are still discovering in nonfiction if you do a certain kind of nonfiction. But I know what she means, that fiction, you're making it up and you get to have this sort of wild relationship to the work. But nonfiction requires a kind of discipline and knack, because you have to move people through something that can feel very, very staid. And I think the question is, like, how do you elevate, the world of nonfiction so that people are as caught up in it? And how do you speed up the story and slow the story down when you only have a certain collection of facts, right? You can't make stuff up. And you also can't, I can't just kill one of my characters if they're alive, right? I mean, they have to sort of be alive. So it has its own challenges in that way. And so.
It's wonderful. I want to give people an opportunity to ask some questions, but I'll beforehand, and you all can ask questions, or the folks online, but is there anything that you have read recently that is unexpected and has been sort of meaningful or affecting? It can be like small thing, but or a fact, or
a thing that so Dorothy Allison wrote this book called do you know this book? I Know 2 or 3 Things for Sure.
I don't know that one.
Okay. So I actually know Dorothy. I thought I knew Dorothy Allison.
Okay.
But I never heard of it. I don't know where I got the reference, but anyway, I got this book. It's a tiny book. It's like 40 pages.
Okay.
Oh my God.
It's great.
It's called I Know 2 or 3 Things for Sure. And you will appreciate this because you just have written this amazing tome about the South.
Which is, there's a cave part that is directly inspired by Dorothy Allison's
see,
Cave Dwellers.
Okay,
yeah.
so you need to. And so, but just the story, how she tells it, the magic in the structure itself, how it reminds me so much of, it's funny, I feel like this book and Lucille Clifton's Generations are like talking with one another. You know, there's that moment in the beginning of Lucille Clifton's Generations where they have the phone call. And, it's like the white lady who's like, I'm a sales, I think your people are sales. And the character's like, not sure who you are. But I almost feel like Dorothy Allison's family were that woman on the other side of the phone. So it's been so much fun to think about generations, to think about what Dorothy Allison, and also just the writing is.
She's
I mean,
extraordinary.
it's really something else. So that has been blowing my mind.
Okay, yeah.
In small and big ways. And it's so hot, I just want to write this. I have a fantasy of a book that's just so small and tight and just like,
Yeah. I can't wait to read it. Do we have any questions? I can keep going.
Well, we do have a question online, and I'll read the first one. The first question I have is, what struck me in the Yellow House is how the impact of Katrina depended greatly on the race and socioeconomic status of residents. It got me thinking about the intersection of climate change and environmental racism. As a journalist, what do you think we should watch for in this area over the next few years?
I think probably everything. I think what's really challenging now with what's happening with the environment and the climate and geography is that the place has already been built. This is what's tricky about it, right? I mean, the place has already been built. So the thing has already been sort of put into motion. And I think we're at a moment in our country right now, right, where we see we're reaping what has already been sort of put into motion. Yes. And that's terrifying in the sense that it's very hard to know, what happens now. But I do know the power of all of us collectively. And I think, it's hard to say because there's always the question of what are the actual policies. I hate to use the P word, policies, but like what actually creates change in the world? Like how do we actually move the needle? Because this is sort of baked into the fabric of the place.
Well, see, I feel like when I read The Yellow House, this is about a design problem in some core way.
It's a design problem, which is really my obsession. And so I don't know actually that I have the answer, right, about what to do about the design problem. But I think part of it is the work we do to call out the design, to illuminate the design.
Yes, right.
To say we have to figure out some way collectively, I mean, not politically, but collectively as human beings, to do something different. And I don't exactly know. I'm joining hands with everyone I know who can think about this, but the design is there. And I think, you know, in New Orleans, there's a lot of debate about, you know, whether the bridge, the Claiborne Avenue Bridge, is you know, if that bridge got taken down, then maybe that will correct some kind of inequity that happened. And it's like, but that already happened. So then what, right? And so in the current model, I think, how do we make spaces for questions, for pushing, for advocating, for advocacy, and for actual change? I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, I mean, I think this is part of the problem with the P word is that it is always imagined in the pre-existing frame, right? So the imagination is contracted by the frame, right? So, you know, it's sort of like, well, if we make this corrective, right? We bring in the structural engineers and they make that corrective, but you make a particular corrective without correcting an order which presumes that some people are going to be hungry and some people are going to be out of work and some people are going to be forced to work under horrific conditions. And so that, you know, and then people say, well, we tried this thing, but it didn't work. Well, but you know, it's like, you know, a Band-Aid on a, you know, on a levee crashing down, essentially. You know, these moments where it's sort of like these. So I think it is I mean, at the core, there's a crisis of political imagination. And every time we move to the edge of like thinking, maybe we can redo this, and people are sort of pushed back into fear, right? And so I think the question, especially, and I feel like I'm always putting pressure on young people, but, you know.
Yeah.
Y'all the folks with the imagination. Like it has to be to push beyond what has existed. It's untenable now. It is unsustainable, right? And COVID shows that in a way like nothing else, right?
It truly, there are so many code words for everything. I mean, in New Orleans, the big thing is like preservation.
Right.
But what does preservation mean? Preserving what exactly? And how much does it cost?
Right.
And so the moment we begin to unravel that, we see the huge fallacy in that.
Yeah.
And right? So that's part of it.
Yeah. Well, see, this is why I thought I loved the way that you instead of in other books, and I'm not criticizing any of the books, but the reference was Katrina, the storm, the storm, the storm.
Right.
You talked about the water. It's a paradigm shift because the water is ever present, and the water and a relationship between land and people and water is a different orientation than the crisis moment.
Sure, and the water. I mean, I think I'll be writing about water till the day I die. Like I'll probably be on my deathbed yelling out water.
Yes.
Because it is for me the heart of everything. It's the kind of existential challenge, right? It's a human and bodily challenge of a species made of water. It's what's happening in our world and how hard it is to control it, narratively and spiritually. It's water, you know, and it's like the central issue, really. And I think it's really a problem when things are miscast. And, you know, it was also just a very, very direct way to tell the story of August 2005 in a way that was the truth about it, right? That this had nothing to do with Katrina, that, you know, water came crashing in because of official negligence. But yeah, so that idea of what we do about water in all of its various tumultuous and also ecstatic forms, maybe is the obsessive question to answer your earlier question.
I love that. there was another question. Did you have a question?
So I'm going to try to phrase this in the way that I want it to come out. But my question is basically about the writing process itself. And with something so personal and intimate to you, like how do you know that the writing process is over? Or how often do you return to these thoughts and the things that you write in this book after it having been published and kind of, I guess, immortalized in its current form?
What a great question. I think that when it can't be overestimated how mapped out the book is. It's such a precise sliver of something, and in the sort of design of it, one of the ways that I have no emotion about it is that I remember when I was first working on this book, I would be on the phone with various friends and I'd be like, the narrator. And they'd be like, you? And I'd just be like, no, the narrator. And I'd say like, this character, Curl, he's like a maroon. And they'd be like, your brother Curl? No, this character. So I think for me, right, I see this as so specifically a story that I'm trying to tell. And so if this story that I'm trying to tell is a concentric circle, the sort of point in the middle is that house. And then I write the stories that are on each rung from that central point. And that is a very specific story I'm telling. And all these people are the supporting cast of the house's story, including myself, right? So in this book, I think that's one of the ways that I can't think of it as a story of myself, because it's a story of me in a particular world, which is different from the story of myself. Maybe one day I can write that. So I don't think of it actually in such personal terms. Maybe it's like a psychic trick. The moment before the book came out, and I did think of it in very personal terms, it was devastating. Because I, was worried what people would think. And, I was a journalist, so my siblings, I recorded them. They knew what was going to be in it. I didn't read the book to them, but they had a really good sense of what was coming, right? So that was like my sort of ethical thing. But I think because it was so finite a world for me and so specific a world, I almost feel like it's not about me, which could just be a delusion. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. So I think in your work, right, you're crafting so specifically that it's like the narrative serves a self, a certain self, that is like, yes, me, some version of me, some portion of me, but not me as you see me now, perhaps, right? Is that just...
No, I mean, it makes it help. It's funny when people with Breathe, when people would say, "Oh, how do your sons feel about having been written about?" And I'm like, "Well, they're not those people now." Right. Like that was a moment and but the relationship lives. Right. So it's a picture.
It is.
It's an artifact. It goes from being you to being something, and thank goodness.
I know,
right?
Otherwise it would be, I mean, it is weird because I remember when I was transcribing interviews, I wasn't talking to my siblings. And they'd call and be like, what's going on with you? What's wrong with you?
Right.
And I'd say, but I just talked to you. And they'd be like, no, you
didn't.
So I was confusing the sort of their voice in my ear with this and so I think when the book was done, I could resume a kind of way that I have with them, which is not at all about who they are in this sort of freeze frame.
do you experience that with New Orleans at all? In the sense, does the city feel different to you after, or the place, or East in particular? Like, how?
Right. I think with New Orleans, I feel like I just know it less and less and less.
Oh, wow, okay.
I think I mostly feel that I only hit the tip of the iceberg in this book. So I'm like, I have to go away from New Orleans in the next book, but there's some part of me that's just like, I just want to be obsessed, like, Wyden with Homewood and Didion with California. Like, I just need to go back and keep, like, banging against something, because it just feels more and more strange to me. I'm like, is every place this strange? Or, so I see it, I'm knowing it differently.
And it's a place, I mean, all cities are living, but one of the things that stands out, and I'll just admit, many of the things that people describe as unique to New Orleans, I don't necessarily think, but I do think it has a vitality in terms of encounter, right? So the whole world meets there constantly, which is, I think is...
Yeah, I think, right, exactly. For me, the strength of New Orleans is the community. I think there are no communities like I really think this is true. It's the people. It's how they experience themselves in the company of others, with other people. It's just an unusual and amazing strength of the place.
Yeah.
But that's precisely what the issue is, too, at the heart of it all, right? Because if you have an education system where every school is a charter school and every child is being bused out of a community to a school that is not in the community.
Right. And all the teachers are destabilized. And,
Right. When the teachers who are part of the community are no longer part of the community. So this also brings us back into doubling in on ourselves and saying, okay, so if that's a great strength of the place, then what happens when that's gone?
Yeah. Are there other questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Gilles. I sort of missed the beginning, so forgive me if my question sounds repetitive, but in terms of writing nonfiction and a story about yourself, I was wondering, was there a point when you knew that you were ready to revisit that time? I think for me, so many experiences, I've always wanted to document sort of some experiences I've had in the past, but I never know when I'm ready to go back. And I think there's this conflict. And am I judging or am I assessing what happened with my eyes now, with what I know now? Is that the right approach? Or should I just go with, should I try to just reproduce the moment as I was experiencing it? And I never feel ready. So that's why I just keep writing fiction, because it's just a product of my imagination. So I'm wondering if when you were writing that, so did you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to go back and write it? Yeah, thank you.
That's such a good question. There are so many questions in there, right? Because part of the question actually is, I think, a question about form. Like what maybe are the perceived limitations of the form. And I want to answer a question about is there a right time to go back, but I think with the form question, I think that was the struggle I had structurally in the book, and why there's this sort of weird omniscient narration happening in the beginning, because I'm not born yet, and structurally I didn't feel that I could exist in the book and have the same narrative, right? So, but for me, in terms of, I've always been a notebook keeper in a very serious way. I mean, from 14, 12 or so on. And I have all these notebooks. So there was a literal way that I could go back. And so many of the quotations in the book are, in fact, things I had in my notebook or like, when I was writing a letter to a childhood friend, I had the letter, in the notebook. So I had these sort of artifacts and objects that I could refer to that put me in a place. But it was very, very painful. To write this book was very, very painful because it is, I think, a book about loss also. And revisiting any form of loss, the loss of my father, the loss of my childhood friend, what it has meant to be, the sole survivor on the scene, it was really hard. And I think, Kiesi Layman says it best maybe when he talks about, taking care of your heartmeat, and like when you're writing hard things, you have to be minding yourself. And there is no good time, right? You just sort of feel the compulsion maybe to do it. And you start, and then maybe, as in the work I'm doing now, you maybe don't feel much compulsion, but you just sort of jump in, and then you start to understand why you're so ready, right? But yeah, there isn't a right moment, and I think the form thing is real, but for me, I'm not a make up the quote that I think they said person, so I tried in form. So like W.G. Zabald does interesting things where he, when people are talking to each other in the present, and he can flash back to the past. So I was just like reading other writers and trying to figure out how they go between past and present, because there is an adult sensibility in the book, but for me, it didn't exist in the first 100 pages.
You have a question?
I have a question over here. The question reads, in your work, you mentioned feeling absence more strongly than feeling presence. What advice would you give students feeling absent from family while trying to take full advantage of all Princeton has to offer?
I mean, that is such a wow, right? Because you must have stuff to say about this, Imani, but I think my other obsession has to do with leaving and coming back.
Yes.
And it's something I still practice a lot, leaving and coming back. And the thing that is so constitutional about me is that there is no one I want to impress more than the people from my family or from my street in New Orleans. Really, I think that will never change. And that connection, right? It's like, how do you have that strong connection happening? Because I think that connection that for me is the feeder. And there are so many funny stories of, my mom calling Berkeley Barclays, and like people laughing in the family, because it's like, this woman really has no concept of, whatever thing you're doing at Berkeley, and like that feeling like a relief to me.
Yes.
And so I think that's a challenge though, right? Because everyone has a different family. We don't know what the situation is, but I think that is so real, to somehow find a way to be elsewhere and be cultivating this other self, and then reuniting all of that with whatever is your conception of home.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think, Imani?
I always think about, I had a teacher in high school, Janet Eisendrath, who ran up to me one day, and it's a really kind of profound moment, and she had tears streaming down her face, and she said, "You're the only one who understands what it feels like to be homesick wherever you are." And that was to a certain extent true, but not. I didn't feel homesick when I was at home, in my home in Birmingham, but most of the time I wasn't at home, right? And so for me, this question is really profound, because so many of us spend most of our lives away from the home in the most core sense of the word, and yet have to find ways not just of carrying it with us, but actually being what we have learned to be through home, right? So when I say, it sounds, and I always say it sounds trite, because it does sound trite when I say, my grandmother was the smartest person I ever knew. Everything I've ever written comes from her, but it's true, right? Because she taught me how to see, right? How to interpret in the most, in the most fundamental way. And so I think it doesn't. So all that to say, you don't, at Princeton or any other university or any other way that you're away from home, you're not going to be able to replace homesickness or missing or, the intimacy, the security. If home is an intimate, secure place, it's not for everyone. But if it is, you're not going to, but there are ways of being what it is that you most cherish in these places. And when you combine that with just incredible opportunities out in the world, I think something really beautiful can come of it, right? And so, but it requires courage.
And the self is a sort of, a literal home.
Yes, that's true.
And the way that we are home for ourselves and for other people is worth cultivating.
That's right. Because, can I ask, because that makes me want to talk to you, because one of the way you've talked about Harlem having been a home for, I find it deeply moving. And that's because it's a place you made yours.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because I have this knack for making many families and many sort of homes. It's like my thing. And I think it's because I'm a geography person. And if I feel untethered, that's a problem for me. So I'm always trying to find grounding and have a compass to know where I am. It might just be, I don't know, something about me.
Yeah.
And so Harlem, and really the people in Harlem, the way they are, how they pay attention to you, how they monitor, your comings and goings.
Right.
How interested they are.
Yeah.
How they peacock in the streets. That it's like that sensuality, I think, that made me feel like I was home, and that's very real for me still. So I think we go out in search of it in ways. And sometimes we find things that we don't have anywhere else. And that becomes our orientation of home that we can give to someone else.
Because I think, my mind was taken there because I do think, we talk a lot about universities and institutions as often places that can feel, distant and cold, but they are also these, crossroads, and you can find your people in there. And so it's like sort of exactly what you described, how do you find your people? What is your geography through the space that allows you to craft some sense of belonging, which may not be what is sort of a preordained understanding of what it means to belong to Princeton or anywhere else, right? That's it may just be your, maybe you're like 3 or 4 disaffected friends who cook dinner together once a week that becomes a home, right? Those, and I think it's a very different kind of crossroads, but Harlem is another crossroads place. It was a destination, a place to make it, right? So, and of course, there's generations there now, but those types of places have a possibility kind of built in too.
That's true. Yeah, these are very specific places that put us in a certain mindset about what it means to be alive, right? And I think maybe being part of that story is yet another way of finding a geography. Right? It's a way of consuming narrative and engaging in one's own narrative, the choice of where to be.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's part of it too, right? Wherever you come, or if you're at Princeton or elsewhere, then that is a geography you've chosen, and that's part of the narrative that you compose about the South.
Yes.
And it's like figuring out what that means to you on some existential level. That is the piece that gets you to home, right? Somehow.
Yes, I guess.
Hi, kind of along similar lines, I had a question about space and tourism. How would you differentiate engaging with a space from touring a space? And how would you encourage your readers to engage with the space that you're describing, both in the context of your novel and outside of it, rather than merely just touring it?
That's good. I mean, it's so interesting because as somebody who travels a lot, I'm always like, oh, am I just being a tourist, right now? So I'm trying to think about the ways in which I engage spaces. I think part of it for me, in my mind, it's a bit trickier when it's a highly mythologized place, right? Because there is a frame that a lot of people have, and you hear it in the questions they ask, you hear it in the things they care about, right? And sometimes it's as simple as forgetting about that frame, not caring about those things, and actually listening and learning about what people are actually talking about and what matters to them, right? And telling that story when you get back home, right? As opposed to sort of the well-trotted out narrative. And New Orleans is a town of baked-in stories, and in ways this happens in Harlem too. But I think that openness, and it's actually what I try to do, is get out of the car wherever I am and walk around or ride a bike or, say hi to people, get to know people, feel lost, feel confused, be clear about the fact that I know very little, and be an explorer in that way, I think. That's what I would say. But I actually think it's harder for people to do. I actually know this after having written this book. Like, it's so much easier for people to talk about Katrina and, how terrible that was than to talk about city planning, or why is it that there was a short end of a long street, or why is it that you had to cross, a highway on your way to school or to the grocery store. Why is that? Why is zoning that way? Those are the harder, more challenging questions. So if people could engage around those things having to do with mapping and systemic injustice, that's already going quite far, I think, to not just touring.
And you're a walker
Oh, yes.
everywhere, right?
Yeah, I love to walk.
I mean, and you get a different public transportation too, but walking is you're on the ground. You just see the relationships in between space in ways that are different from if you're just taking the official tours, right?
And it tells you so much. When you're in a place that encourages walking, you have a different kind of mentality.
Yeah.
About the place, about the people of that place, right? When you're in New Orleans East, one of the big tells about it changing was the driving culture, that no one was walking. I mean, it's like going to LA, when you see the few souls at the bus stop, you go, wow.
Yeah.
It has to be hard, right? Taking public transportation in LA. It's just not meant to be. They don't value, right, this sort of closeness and way of being on the street level in the same way. Although I think Linnell George might have some tips on that. But I think that's really it, is to be clear about what the frame is. And I think Jamaica Kincaid was in a small place.
Oh, yes.
Slaps our hand until it's red on the subject of this very forcefully.
It's beautiful.
Right?
It's
And
elegant,
really helps us see all the connections, that the things we're seeing and loving aren't the things as they are experienced by the people who hold up the narrative for the capitalist purposes.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny that you describe places that aren't walking places, because I was as you said that, I was thinking, you can't walk around Birmingham unless you know people. It's not a place besides downtown, and really barely that, unless you know something of the place. You can't it's not a wandering place at all. Right, and so there's also, I think, places, and it's also part of why I think there's so many different sort of cultures of the South, because it's one of those places that holds you at a distance, right? It's not a place, yes, people are gracious, but part of it is because you can't even sort of make your way into the neighborhood.
Right, you can't be on the streets. And then, and also, how would someone be taken?
Right, what are you doing
if they're,
here?
the wandering Mary of town,
Right.
Like, I mean, literally, what would...
Why are you here?
Right,
Yes.
this person has lost it. What do they do? I mean, that's also just has something to do with the freedom of walking. I mean,
Yes.
right?
You have, breached certain social conventions for you. Yeah. Are there questions?
Yeah. I have a question here that says, in your book, you discuss wanting to be dropped off at the edge of the school parking lot, feeling a mismatch with the school you attended. What advice would you give students who may feel similarly about Princeton?
Y'all are coming with the questions. That was really an important thread in that book for me. I was trying to think about what it meant to grow up in an area of the city that was cut off from the rest of itself, what it meant to grow up on a street that was cut off from the rest of itself, what it meant to buy into a certain story about cut-offness. And, part of the shame I'm feeling about the house, about the condition of the house, about what it means about me, is that I'm conflating the condition of being a kid from the short end of a long street with my actual worth, right? So in those moments when I'm, I don't want my mother to be seen by my classmates because I feel like, I'm different, I'm not like them. When I don't want our car to be seen because I think it's a lesser than car. There is such danger, I've come to know, in conflating, the sort of circumstances of your life with who you are. And it's also equally as easy to do. But it's now something that I'm very hyper aware of, right? That there is no circumstantial design that tells me something about who I am.
Yes.
That who I am is completely separate from the circumstantial design. And then, of course, that's very, very easily becomes about race in America. Because if you are then believing, right, that like the fact that we have a house on sinking grounds in an area of the city that has the worst zoning policy imaginable, is that actually about me?
Right.
Right? Like, what do I have to do with zoning? I'm 6 months old, right? So it's like a way, so I think going back to the question, it's sort of, that moment of shame of not claiming who I am, who my mother is, all these beautiful things that she has created and made for us, was a way of distancing myself from myself. And so I think to not conflate, to not imagine that the circumstances are you, and to, again, go back to whatever that home is, right, that exists, whether you're in Princeton or not, is the key. But that can be hard to do, especially in today, I think.
It's so hard. I think especially in a display generation, right? So the self is supposed, there's so much pressure to spectacularize who and what you are. And then to make a spectacle, and of course you know, a photo or an image is a fixed thing, right? And we're breathing people,
Breathing, yeah.
right? And but I think just because the student, it is one of those things that resonates so deeply because I hear it so much, this, you know, the thing of being misfitted to certain institutions. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that when you are a member of any institution, you become part of its creation, right? You are
yes.
you're a co-creator of what this
That's
place
so
is.
great.
Right, so ethically, you know, having that experience, part of the responsibility becomes making it different.
That is so
You know?
so powerful. You know, that's it. Because, you know, I mean, remembering that Princeton is this also hyper-mythologized
Right,
place that is
yes.
very happy in its story of
Right.
itself, right?
Yes.
So whenever
So-
you have hyper-mythologized places, it's very hard. It's like
Yeah.
Carrie Mae Weems in the photographs in Rome,
Yes.
where she talks about these buildings as like edifices of power, that they're literally designed so that when you stand next to them, you feel like nothing and no one.
Yes.
And if you actually internalize the feeling that the building makes you feel, then you will never, ever fight against it, right? It will have subsumed you and subdued you.
Yes.
That's like the whole focus of this series of photographs. And I think that's precisely what you're saying, right? Is that, but there's actually the opportunity from inside to make something new of it.
Yeah. Imperative, maybe. Even, right? I mean, I don't know. It feels so essential with all of these institutions of power,
Sure.
from the publishing industry
Oh,
to
all of them.
universities, right? And that's why I love the way you talk about the communities in New Orleans, because people hold on despite, you know, the diaspora that's been created, the destabilization, you know, the gentrification.
Sure.
People are still there.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions? Do we have time for another
We'll do
question?
one more?
or two?
Yeah, I'd say the last question then would be, what is it like to love a place that no longer exists physically, but holds great significance in your life nonetheless?
Wow, these questions. You know, that is a bizarre feeling, I think. Because often I when I go back and I sort of go to the spot where the house was, I think, you know, it's sort of like, wow, if I hadn't written about this place, would it have existed? Right? It's like, it's hard to imagine it having been there. And then I think, when I think of all of the families in New Orleans who had such houses, you know, it's sort of, maybe it goes back to that idea of the object or the piece of furniture, that it's something now that I can sort of rearrange within myself. And a lot of the question that I was asking myself and writing on the wall when I was doing this book was, you know, how can I resurrect a house with words? Is it possible? Right? And maybe that gets to why I write in particular, and maybe even the limits of what it means to have written, which is that, you know, the place existed and now it's gone. But this is also what Whitfield Lavelle is talking about in his paintings, right? That is it actually gone, right? Or is there a sort of invisible imprint that we can no longer see? And maybe that's also a climate question.
On that note, that gorgeous note, thank you so
Thank
very
you.
much.
This was so much
It
fun.
was beautiful.